Well, let me add my welcome to Susan's. We're so glad that you've decided to spend the morning with us for this Lenten Quiet Day. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you this year's Lenten Quiet Day speaker. I'll introduce him, and then you'll have probably about 10 minutes or so to use the restrooms, grab some more food or coffee, and then we'll come back at 9 o'clock and he'll begin his first meditation. Father Clooney is a Roman Catholic priest, as you probably guessed by the collar, a member of the Society of Jesus for 55 years. He serves regularly in a Catholic parish on the weekends. During the week, Father Clooney serves as the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. He's joining us all the way from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I think it's safe to say enjoying a little respite from the winter weather. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, Father Clooney taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. He is a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. If this is piquing your interest, be sure to come back tomorrow night when Father Clooney will offer a lecture reflecting on his 50 or so years of learning from Hindu traditions as a Catholic priest. In 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a professorial research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. His most recent honorary doctorate was awarded in November of 2019 by Regis College at the University of Toronto. He is serving currently as the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Father Clooney has taken as his theme for this quiet day 3 encounters with Jesus in the Gospel of John. Over and over, the evangelist shows us people meeting Jesus, often as it were by chance. And yet it is these encounters that speak to us eloquently today, showing us paths to meeting God, seeing Jesus in our own time and place. Each meditation will explore one such encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John 4, between Jesus and the man born blind in John 9, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene in John 20. We are delighted to welcome Father Clooney to Trinity-by-the-Cove for this year's Lenten Quiet Day, and hope that the meditations and the space for quiet reflection afford you an opportunity to experience Jesus afresh in your own lives this Lent. Please join me in welcoming Father Clooney.
Yes, okay. All right. Because it would be a great loss if I spoke and you couldn't hear me. So, now as I say in church, if you can't hear me and you're in the back, you can always move to the front. So I've already been introduced. There's no need to do that again. But I would just like to add my word of thanks at the beginning to the Daughters of the King for hosting this event, to Susan for administrating, showing everyone the details of being here today, making it a warm and friendly environment. Father Nicholas for his gracious welcome. We Zoomed a few weeks ago to talk about this event, and he was very kind and very welcoming. So I'm very grateful to the parish. And my old friend, Bruce McKever, in the back, I think most of you know Bruce, who is the mastermind behind this entire event, getting me to come down here, giving me the chance to leave Cambridge, Massachusetts in March and come down to a warmer climate. He had to twist my arm all the way around behind my back, but I'm grateful to Bruce as well, who spent time with us at Harvard a few years back. Seeing Jesus in the Gospel according to John. As you know, the Gospel of John is the last of the 4 Gospels, written a generation later. And I think by the time of John, or this tradition of the Apostle John, there's both an intimacy with Jesus and the memory of the people who knew him best and lived with him and walked with him and were part of his ministry, his friends, and also a sense that we're becoming distant. Those who knew him best have now been dying off. Those who have come into the church, Jews and Gentiles both, many have never met Jesus or even met somebody who knew Jesus personally. And I think whereas the other Gospels, Luke and Mark and Matthew, perhaps were based on the idea that we have people in our midst who remember and we're simply telling the story. In the Gospel according to John is a crossover to say, what happens if you don't know Jesus? What happens if you weren't there in the beginning and haven't seen him? So I always take as primal in this Gospel the possibility that is said at the end of chapter 20, which is at the end of the handout you have, I have written these words that you may have life. I have written these words that you may come to know Jesus. Blessed are you who have not seen but have believed based on what you have heard. And therefore, I think the challenge before us when we hear this gospel is to open it up and not be preoccupied only with the good historical questions, the good redaction questions, good questions about this verse or that verse, but to realize that this gospel is meant across time and space, across thousands of years, to draw us in, that we begin to see and imagine and feel and think ourselves in the Gospel of John. And that the people we'll meet today, the Samaritan woman, the man born blind, Mary at the tomb, are not simply figures from the past, and I wish I had been there like them, but aren't we in our own way that woman, that man, Mary in the garden? That primal passage near the beginning of the text that sets the tone, I'll just read you this and then I'll turn to chapter 4. The next day, John was again standing with two of his disciples. And as he watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. But when Jesus turned and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And they said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying. They remained with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. Jesus, in the prologue of John, the light in the darkness, the Word of God coming into the world, he dwelt among us. And in this primal scene on the beach, they follow him and he says, "What do you want?" "We want to see you. We want to be where you are." And the invitation that I think is meant for them, but I think for the whole gospel, the key that unlocks the door is come and see. This is for you. This is for us. And I think what we're asked to do, and I'll do this with each of the three scenes, is very briefly sketch it. Our time is so limited. But to realize that then we're asked, in the very Ignatian Jesuit way, I might say, to imagine ourselves in the scene. Am I like the two disciples who followed Jesus on the beach and suddenly he turns and says, "What do you want?" Am I like the woman at the well who's been ostracized, alienated, left out, pushed to the side? Suddenly this Jewish man is speaking to me. Am I like the man born blind? Right from the very beginning, I've been disabled. I've been unable to see anything, much less see Jesus. Is it possible, is it too late in midlife or late life to change? That is their story, and I think John is saying it is your story because you can meet Jesus by living out these accounts and imagining yourself to be part of them. Have we ever been people grieving at the tomb, losing a loved one certainly, unable to see God present where we are, unable to know that the person standing there is not just some caretaker, some gardener, some healthcare worker, but is Jesus calling us by name? Can we enter the scenes is really the challenge before us this day. So I chose as the first scene the encounter of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. If we really had a lot of time, we could read aloud the whole chapter and talk about it part by part, which we cannot do. And I gave you part of it, I'm sure you know it well anyway, but I gave you part of it in the brochure you have. And I think the beginning of it, which is a little bit before what I actually give you, is an ordinary scene on an ordinary day. So Jesus and his disciples have been walking along. They are tired, they are thirsty, they are hungry, it's the middle of the day, probably hot sun. And Jesus sits down by this well, and the disciples go off into town to look for food. They need something, they're human beings. The Word of God come into the world hungers and thirsts. And there Jesus is by the well, but being the Son of God, or despite being the Son of God, he doesn't have a bucket. He can look down in the well and perhaps see the water, but he has no chance to get the water. He's unable to do this, and this woman comes, and breaking through right away, Jesus says to her, "Give me some water to drink. I'm thirsty." And the woman immediately kind of identifies herself as saying, "Why are you talking to me? Don't you know that I am a woman, you are a man, we're here alone, this is very inappropriate. And also, you Jews don't talk to Samaritans. We're kind of marginal figures, we're ostracized in the community. You think that somehow we worship God improperly, even though we say we're 100% of the tradition of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob like you people do. We worship here," as she'll say in a few verses later, "we worship here on this mountain, you worship in Jerusalem. How can we possibly talk to each other? Why don't we just argue with one another?" And I think John puts this scene before us because in many deep ways, I think he's realizing in the earliest church, in the ministry of Jesus, and as we can see for thousands of years thereafter, there are all kinds of biases and bigotry, all kinds of reasons for exclusion that make it impossible for somebody to encounter Jesus face to face. And you can imagine the scene ending in a disaster, kind of, or a sad moment, where the woman turns and walks away, carrying her bucket with her. But the genius is that they begin to talk to one another. As it says here on the page, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that's saying to you, "Please give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And I think this is part of the point for John, is this woman was not expecting anything new. In a sense, it's too late for her. As she reveals a bit later, she's been married 5 times. And as Jesus points out, the man you're living with now is not your husband. Midlife, older, who knows? But this woman clearly encrusted with the hard times of life, coming to Jesus, and suddenly this man who's staying there wants to talk to her, wants a drink, and then says, "I can give you the water of life." And I think partly she's saying, well, I'm thirsty for the water of life. I want to be a person who's not dried out, not desiccated, not giving up on reality, but it's too late. And suddenly, and the surprise I think is that here in this place on this day, when she happens to come down to the well at the middle of the day when nobody else is around because she's probably ostracized even in the town, when she comes down to the well, this strange man is there, and suddenly they begin to talk and enter into a relationship. And as you can see in the gospel, if you read the whole passage, little by little, she, in a sense, loosens up. They begin to talk about, you worship in Jerusalem, we worship here. But Jesus puts before us some of the most remarkable words in the Gospel of John. The time will come when we will worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. And I think what John is saying is that Jesus is the one who opens up the door to the Spirit, opens up the way of truth if you're truthful about yourself, if you're truthful about your barriers, your bad experiences, your 5 marriages, whatever that might be in our lives, the sense of being ostracized and left out. If you begin to notice this, then you begin to be the kind of person who can drink the water of life. Of course, one of the sub-themes in John's Gospel all the way through is that people often are offered the water of life and they don't want it. Just as in John 6, which we'll not be able to talk about, Jesus says, here's the bread of life. Participate in my life. Eat my flesh, drink my blood, be with me. And people say, no, I don't think so. I think I'll walk away. They leave it behind. And the brilliant thing, the perfect thing about this woman in this gospel scene is that for some reason, this is the day in which she begins to change. She begins to become a different person. She doesn't brush off this Jewish man. She doesn't go the other way. Presumably, although it never says, presumably she gives him a drink of water. And then suddenly she realizes that this man is showing me my life. Scholars and preachers have for generations wondered, how did he know that she was married 5 times? How did he know anything about her? And I always thought perhaps it was simply a sense that this woman looks like she's had a hard life. She's kind of, bent over, she's embittered, her life is kind of on hold, guessing that this woman is really not able to function properly. And saying to her, if you understand who is speaking to you, your life can change now. The sequel, of course, is quite amazing in itself. First of all, the apostles are not there for most of this. As I think in many scenes in the Gospels, but certainly in John, there's a certain kind of irony that the apostles, who are the closest followers of Jesus, who are probably the best men in the world, good-hearted, generous, wanting to be with him, they miss this scene. They're off in the town looking for food, and when they come back, they sort of say, well, who, what? What happened? Did something happen? Did we miss something? And Jesus says, don't you understand that the harvest is ripe, is plentiful? All we need are people to go into the vineyard or into the fields for the harvest. And I think he means, and I think John means, don't you understand, disciples, you're waiting for some big event, you're waiting for some kind of apostolic revelation. But don't you realize that every person you meet is a possibility for that exchange of life that we're looking for? Jesus didn't go there simply to say, I will now come and preach to the Samaritans. He didn't even want to preach to anyone. He just said, I'm thirsty. And suddenly this woman's life is transformed. And I think John is pointing out about the clueless disciples who don't get it. And then also pointing out to us thousands of years later, if you're waiting for the mission to begin by somebody like, the starting gun or waving the flag or a big renewal, don't you realize that the possibility of the mission is the next person you talk to? And you might look at the person and say, oh, nope, this person is very different from me. They have a different religion. They look different. She's had a hard life. She's just not one of us. Cannot be. And John is saying, look again, because you too are like that. You too are a person in need. And remarkably, the woman becomes perhaps one of the very first, after the first chapter, one of the first apostles in the Gospel of John. Because she goes back into the town, and quite amply she says, and here is a man who's told me everything about myself. He somehow revealed my life to me. And she doesn't literally mean that, every detail of my life, but somehow finally somebody who broke through the fact that I'm a woman, that I'm a Samaritan, that I've been married 5 times, that I have a hard life, I go alone to the well in the middle of the day. Suddenly there's somebody who's talking to me in a way that's giving me life. Somebody who says to me, in the future, the measure of our spiritual growth will be truth, life, the Spirit. And so she goes in and tells them how wonderful it is that this man is here. And they come running out to see Jesus. And they come out to see him. And then when they meet him, remarkably 2 things. One thing is they say, now that we've met you, it's even greater than what the woman said. We see you for ourselves. We hear you for yourself. The woman was like an instrument. The woman opened the way and said, go see that man, Jesus. And they did go and see him. And then they said, there's even more here than the preacher said. And I think that's a reminder for those of us who wear Roman collars and so forth, that anything we can say is only a starting point, because when we come and see, then it's always greater than what that fellow or she or he had to say. And the woman opens the door, they come, and then remarkably, in one of the only scenes in the Gospels, and I could be corrected on this, where it's not simply hospitality, but Jesus goes and stays with them for a few days. They say, please come and stay with us. And so improbably, an impure, not properly vetted Jewish place, he goes and stays with them, he drinks their wine, he eats their food, and presumably at that level, she's reintegrated into the community. And all these things begin to work out. He stays with them for a few days. Remember in the first chapter, they come and see Jesus, they stay for a few hours. Now they stay for a few days. And so the door is opened. Things begin to change. So where does this leave us? On one level, the invitation, I think, in the 20 minutes we'll have beginning in just a few minutes, would be to say, imagine, close your eyes, whether you're sitting outside, inside, at the labyrinth, whatever, close your eyes and imagine the scene. Just imagine the hot, dry, dusty day, and imagine the thirst. And you come down to the well, if you're the woman, and you see Jesus there, not as the Savior of the world, but as a man, a Jew who is thirsty. Put yourself into the scene. Or be one of the disciples who frustratingly misses the whole thing by going in town to buy food. Or be the woman when suddenly Jesus says, all of this is spirit and truth. Or one of the neighbors saying, please come and stay in my house for some time. I think we're invited to be in the scene. Or even Jesus. We're not Jesus. We're not like Jesus in many ways. But be looking into ourselves and saying, are there moments in my life when I've been able not to be distracted by prejudice, by bias, by stereotypes, and somehow talk to a person I never would have talked to, and be able to open up an exchange that gives that person life and gives me life? Does that happen? So I think this reading is meant to draw us in. The details can come and go, but we're invited to the unexpected encounter with Christ, where things are possible that seem not to be possible. So I give you 3 questions for reflection, which may or may not help you. If what I just said about imagine the scene and put yourself in it gets you going, then just do that. But I gave you 3 questions for reflection. Can I recall a time when God surprisingly showed up in my life in some place or chance encounter when I did not expect to meet God? Were you ever surprised by God in an encounter when it was the last thing on your mind that I should meet God in this place through this person? Jewish men would almost never speak to Samaritan women. Have I ever encountered Jesus in a person I would normally avoid or simply never talk to? This is all between you and your own heart, no public revelations. But who do we hang out with? Who are our people? Who are the people we see from a distance and don't go near? Have there been moments in your life or my life where I meet somebody like that, a chance encounter in a shop, in an airport, walking down the street, at church, where the person I would least expect even to talk to suddenly becomes for me a person in whom I meet Jesus? And then third, the woman is both a bearer of water and herself at a primal level thirsty. When have I found myself in a position where I planned on helping another, but found myself receiving more than I could give? We're all virtuous people. We're all here because we want to do good. Are we also able to be like that woman who suddenly realizes, I have the bucket, I have access to the well, and he doesn't? Then to realize, I need him more than he needs me. Can you think of a moment in your life when surprisingly you went from being the caregiver, the generous person, the charitable person, to the person you thought you were taking care of suddenly starts taking care of you instead? So I think we stop there. We take a 20-minute break and ponder these issues. We come back at 10:15, I believe. Go forth. Look for the woman at the well. Be the woman at the well. Thank you.